G'day and welcome to another video with Better Pics. Hope this finds everyone well and healthy. So today I wanted to show some techniques within Photoshop of how to dodge and burn your photographs. So this technique, as the terminology may or may not suggest to you, dodge and burn means to lighten or darken specific areas of an image. Now, I always find the dodge and burn terminology rather interesting, and many years ago when I was first starting out in the camera, I took some classes to learn how to print photographs in a traditional wet darkroom, because of course back then I was shooting film, and I was able to learn exactly what the dodging and burning terminology meant. And it basically means to dodge or hold back light falling onto light sensitive paper, or burn, which means to apply more light to light sensitive paper. And by dodging that light to the paper, you're holding it back, and it means that the image does not go as dark, so you're lightening that particular area. Whereas burning means you're applying or allowing through more light to a particular area, which means for light sensitive paper, longer exposure means the paper gets darker. Now, Photoshop does have tools that are called dodge and burn, and if we go over to this little symbol here where we right click, you can see that there's a dodge tool and a burn tool. So for example, the dodge tool, as I mentioned earlier, means that traditionally in a wet darkroom, if you dodged a part of a print, it would get lighter. So if we just select that tool, make it a little bit larger, and then paint, you can see that that part of the image is getting brighter. And it seems to work pretty well. We can select anywhere and simply paint. We've got hardness and size control. I've got hardness at 0 so that it's a soft application around the edges. And that's allowing me to brighten certain parts of the image really nicely. Similarly, if we go to the burn tool, as I suggested earlier, if we select that one and we paint, it's darkening those parts of the image. Really interesting. So you can see you have full control within Photoshop over lightening and darkening different specific areas where you paint or where you apply that tool of the frame, of the image. Now you can see also up here along the tool options that you have shadows, midtones and highlights, so you can target specifically shadow areas. You can see it's a very different effect. Or you can target highlights, very different effect again. Now that certainly does give you some control. You've also got the option there for exposure, so the amount that you're actually applying with each brush tool. So you have that option to increase or decrease. You can see it's quite dramatic there. The amount that the tool is affecting as it's applied to the image. Now we're going to go back to the very beginning with our original untouched image, and I basically want to show you a different method of dodging and burning so that you have flexibility around the amount, where, and a little bit more refinement and control over the specific effect of dodging and burning. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our layer adjustments. Now if you're not seeing this panel, just pop up to Window and you want to see adjustments, and that panel will appear. And top middle one, we want to apply a curves adjustment layer, and the first one we're going to do is simply pop a control point in the middle, and we're going to drop it down so that the image becomes darker. And we're then going to apply another curves adjustment, and we're going to increase with a control point in the middle, exactly the same, increase our exposure to make the image brighter. All right, we're going to pop down to those layer masks, and we're going to hit Control I to invert the mask, or Command I if you're on a Mac. So that basically puts those masks completely black, so they are not affecting the image in any way at all. In fact, if I turn off both those masks, you'll see that we still have the original image underneath. So from here, we're going to select the first of our mask, and we're going to select our brush tool, and we're just going to pop the hardness to 0. had this panel come up by just simply right-clicking on the image, and we're going to increase the size. You can also increase the size by the brackets. Either right makes it bigger, left makes it smaller. And we have opacity, flow, and smoothing up the top there. We're going to drop the opacity to 25%. We're also going to swap over our foreground and background color. So we want our foreground color to be white. And from here, we are going to paint. And you can see wherever I paint, it is allowing that curves adjustment layer. You can see that where I've painted, there's been a slight bit of white applied, only at 25% opacity, which means that anywhere that I paint is allowing that adjustment layer to come through, which is darkening the image, because remember that first curves adjustment was to darken the image. Now, if I want to shelter or stop that adjustment coming through in a certain section, I just need to swap my foreground color back to black and paint back in that area. And that area will go back to black, which means that adjustment layer won't affect the image. Exactly the same as if I go up to my second curves adjustment, and again I select white as the foreground color, and I start to paint, and you can see that that adjustment was to increase exposure or the brightness of the image, and wherever I paint, we'll see an increased exposure coming through. Alright, let's just have a little bit more of a refinement and a few more adjustment layers. Now, the previous adjustment layers were simply clicking and dragging a control point in the middle and dropping it down or pushing it up, which is pretty standard. But as we know, we've got a lot more control over curves than a simple single control point in the middle. Say for example, I click and drag the top right hand corner of that control point, you can see that it is dropping the white level a little bit lower, slightly darkening the image, but particularly the white areas, I'm starting to get a little bit of detail back within that white area. Now, if I want to increase contrast a little bit, I can just make some slight adjustments there with an extra control point, and we're good to go. Now, that's given me an increase in a little bit of detail within the waterfall, which is important because with waterfalls and rainforests, it's very easy to blow out that white area. But I only want it to affect that waterfall and not the rest of the image. So again, I'm going to hit Control or Command I, and which blacks out the mask, which means that none of that adjustment affects any part of the image. And I'm going to simply paint in with my brush selected to white. I'm going to increase that opacity to 100%. I'm just going to paint in that waterfall, and you can see that that adjustment to that white part of the image is only affecting the waterfall. Now, if I feel like that's a little bit too much, I'm going to change my foreground color back to black, and I'm going to decrease the opacity to around 50%. And I'm just going to slightly adjust that back further. This is where you have control not only over the brightness, not only over the area in which the adjustment is being applied, but you have all of those specific adjustments available to you through the Curves Adjustment tool, which means that you can affect different parts of the image differently. In this case, the Curves Adjustment that I want to apply to the water is different to the rest of the rainforest area, including the rock face. Keeping in mind that rainforest green and this rock face is very similar or very close to the tonal value of neutral grey, which means the method of brightening and darkening those areas is going to be very different to the method of brightening and darkening an area that is almost white. You can see if I double click on those curves below, my curve for the waterfall is very different to my curve for increasing exposure. I'm just going to decrease that opacity again, increase my brush size with right hand bracket, and very subtly paint in an increase in exposure for that rock face. Now, at this stage, what I would like to do is another specific situation with the curves is to create a higher contrast for that rock face only. So I'm just going to apply a general curve of increasing contrast to all of the image. And that's just a general S curve, which we all know and love. And you can see it's not a huge S, but it certainly has increased the contrast of the entire image if I turn that on and off. Alright, so now what I want to do is Control I to inverse the mask on that adjustment. And with my brush tool, with white set as the foreground color, I'm going to drop the opacity to 10% because I want to, roughly 10%, because I want to introduce this adjustment very gradually. And keeping in mind that this adjustment is the increase in contrast. And the reason that I've done this is to have an increase in contrast for the rock face. Now make sure your curves mask is selected. And we're going to just very subtly paint in that contrast on that rock face. And you can see as I apply brush strokes, the contrast on that rock face is increasing. And I'm just going to apply some over on this side as well. So I've very subtly applied an increased contrast just to that rock face, because the rock face would have strong contrast in nature anyway. Let's just turn that one on and off. You can see it's very subtle. It doesn't look obvious at all. In fact, you could look at this finished image and not see that there's been contrast applied to a specific area. But that color, that sharpness has all been brought out in that rock face. And it certainly helps to strengthen the image. So dodging and burning can be not only a brightness level, but it can also be a contrast level. It can be a saturation level. It can be a color adjustment level. Obviously, in this case, dodging and burning, when referring back to the traditional meaning of the words within photography, means that we're increasing or decreasing brightness levels and exposure to certain parts of the image, to darken certain parts and to brighten certain parts. However, dodge and burn can be applied in different ways to different parts of the image, and certainly different images to achieve different effects. Now you can see I've got 4 curves down there, and it could very easily become very confusing as to what those curves are, particularly if you save the image as, for example, a PSD, so all of those layers are kept intact, and you come back later and you think, well, gosh, which do those curves actually refer to? Like, what's that one? Now, you could obviously go through and turn them on and off. Okay, that's the waterfall. But another way is to simply just double click on the text and you can type any description you want. So, for example, this one is waterfall. Number 4 was rock contrast. Number 3, curves 2 was increase exposure. And curves number 1 was decrease exposure. So you can see just by changing the names of those layers, I'm able to identify very quickly exactly what they're responsible for. Now, 4 layers, you could argue, well, it's probably not too complicated, I could remember. But if you've got a really complicated image with multiple images making up one image, for example, you've got a different sky, different foreground, you've added in some rocks, and then you've got adjustment layers for all of those separate images, it'd be very easy for you to suddenly have 20, 30 layers. And in that situation, if you come back to an image, which images of those complexity or that level of complexity often takes a lot of work. It's not just a single session of sitting down. So naming those layers will help you to be able to identify exactly what the layers are there for very, very quickly. And it means that ongoing editing process becomes much smoother and much more straightforward. So those are some simple techniques for dodging and burning. Hope they've been helpful. Obviously, you still have the traditional method with using the dodge and burn tool, which works great. But obviously with a layer adjustment and a curves adjustment layer, it means that you have far greater control over how that adjustment affects a specific area, as well as where it affects it by using masks and the paintbrush. Hope this has been helpful. Thanks again for stopping in, and of course if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comment section below, and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.